Since January 2024, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission has arraigned or invited for questioning no fewer than 11 current or former governors. Every single one of them is either in the opposition PDP, the Labour Party, or has publicly broken with the APC. Not one sitting APC governor, not one, who controls state resources and has faced credible allegations in public audit findings has received the same treatment. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And the question that nobody in the mainstream Nigerian press has had the courage to ask directly is this: who is deciding which corrupt officials get prosecuted and which ones get protected? Because if the answer to that question is a political office rather than an independent institution, then what Nigeria is calling anti-corruption is not anti-corruption at all. It is political warfare with a legal uniform on. Stay with me, because what I found in the documents behind this story changes how you read everything that has happened in the last 18 months. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Seun Okimbole's interview on Channels TV with Kenneth Okonkwo produced a moment that the political class noticed, but that most Nigerians scrolled past. Kenneth Okonkwo is a lawyer. He was a prominent Labour Party spokesman. He is not given to loose language, and when he speaks about legal and institutional process, he speaks with precision. And what he said plainly, without metaphor, is that the Tinubu administration is deploying anti-corruption agencies as instruments of political targeting, not as institutions of justice. Now, the question is not whether Kenneth is right or wrong as a matter of opinion. The question is whether the facts support what he said. So let us look at the facts. That statement on Channels TV did not emerge from nowhere. It came in the immediate aftermath of a sequence of EFCC actions that, when you line them up in order and map them against Nigeria's political calendar, tell a very specific story. High-profile arraignments of figures connected to Peter Obi's Labour Party network in the southeast, continued trial pressure on political adversaries of Nyese Wike's faction in Rivers State, the freezing of accounts tied to Atiku Abubakar's PDP fundraising infrastructure, and, running parallel to all of this, a conspicuous, almost total silence from every anti-corruption body towards APC governors who face documented allegations in state assembly reports and federal budget audit findings. The administration's official position, stated repeatedly by the Attorney General of the Federation, by EFCC Chairman Olupanikeni Olukoyede, and by presidency spokespersons, is that enforcement is apolitical, evidence-driven, and continuous from the Buhari era. They argue that Olukoyede was appointed through a constitutional process with Senate confirmation. They argue that the cases being prosecuted were largely inherited from previous administrations. That framing sounds reasonable on the surface, but it deliberately obscures something critical. Corruption in Nigeria is not rare. It is systemic. Every administration, every party, every geopolitical zone has documented cases sitting in EFCC files. The question is not whether cases exist. Cases always exist. The question is which cases get activated when and against whom. That selectivity, the decision about who gets prosecuted and who gets protected, is where political will and prosecutorial independence either converge or diverge. And right now, every observable data point says they are diverging sharply. Here's the fact that reframes this entire conversation, and it has been sitting in a public document the entire time. The EFCC's own 2023 annual report shows that conviction rates in high-profile political cases remain below 12%. 12%. If the goal of this enforcement campaign was genuinely to secure justice, to convict the corrupt and recover stolen assets, that number would be the scandal dominating every press briefing in Nigeria. The administration would be embarrassed by it. The National Assembly would be holding emergency oversight hearings about it. Instead, the administration celebrates arraignments and arrests, high visibility, high drama, maximum media impact, while the actual convictions, the ones that require sustained, independent, rigorous prosecutorial work, continue to stall in court. You do not run a 12% conviction rate if your goal is to convict the corrupt. You run a 12% conviction rate if your goal is to announce that you are fighting corruption while ensuring that the legal process itself becomes the punishment. Hold that thought, because it is the key to everything that follows. To understand how this political prosecution can operate inside a constitutional framework and still remain technically legal, you need to understand the specific architecture of Nigeria's anti-corruption institutions. The EFCC is the primary instrument in this story, but the full picture also runs through the ICPC, the Office of Attorney General of the Federation, the Federal High Court system, and critically, the Department of State Services, whose involvement in detaining opposition figures before formal charges are filed has escalated significantly since mid-2023. Let us start with the EFCC's own legal foundation. The EFCC Establishment Act grants the Commission investigative and prosecutorial powers, but it places the appointment of the Commission's chairman in the hands of the President, subject to Senate confirmation. That single structural fact, presidential appointment, is the load-bearing column of this entire story. Because it means that the most powerful anti-corruption instrument in Nigeria is at its leadership level a presidential appointment, not an independent civil service selection, not a merit-based panel process, a presidential appointment. Now add the second structural fact. Section 174 of the 1999 Constitution gives the Attorney General of the Federation the power of nolle prosequi, the power to discontinue any federal criminal prosecution at any time for any reason with no requirement to explain that decision publicly and no mechanism for judicial review. This means a prosecution can be opened against a political opponent, generating maximum media damage and then quietly discontinued once the political objective has been achieved. Whether that objective is a defection, a withdrawal from a race, or simply silence, the case disappears. The political damage remains. And here is the critical detail. That nolle prosequi power has survived every constitutional amendment process Nigeria has ever conducted. It has no sunset clause, no independent oversight trigger. It has survived because every administration that arrives in power immediately recognizes its utility and has no interest in surrendering it. On paper, there are checks: Senate confirmation of the EFCC chair, National Assembly oversight hearings, the possibility of judicial review of prosecutorial decisions. In practice, those checks have not functioned independently in any administration in Nigeria's Fourth Republic. The Senate that confirmed Olukuyede is an APC-aligned Senate whose leadership was itself the direct product of Tinubu's political engineering in June 2023. The oversight hearings that have occurred have been procedural formalities, and no Nigerian court has ever successfully compelled the Attorney General to reverse a nolle prosequi decision. Has this happened before? Yes. And the most instructive parallel is not Obasanjo in 2005 or Buhari in 2017. It is the period between 2007 and 2010 when the EFCC under Farida Waziri was widely described as having been deliberately weakened and redirected. Cases that had been building substance under Nuhu Ribadu, cases against governors with serious documented evidence, were quietly buried. New cases opened against figures who had become politically inconvenient, and the institution that had briefly threatened to become genuinely independent was brought back into alignment with the presidency that controlled its appointment. The lesson from that period is not that the EFCC failed. The lesson is that the EFCC's independence is not structural. It has never been structural. It is entirely dependent on the political disposition of whoever holds the appointment power. And right now, that appointment power sits in Asorok. There is a specific relationship between the appointment history of Nigeria's last 4 EFCC chairs and their electoral cycles they served. A pattern in the timing of high-profile arrests relative to gubernatorial and presidential campaigns. When you map that pattern, and we are going to map it, it tells you something precise about how this institution has been used across administrations, not just this one. It is the key to understanding not just what is happening now, but what is being prepared for 2027. Let us talk about who actually benefits from this situation. Not in general terms, specifically. The Tinubu administration benefits on 3 levels simultaneously. First, the narrative level. Maintaining a visible anti-corruption posture satisfies international donor optics, World Bank and IMF engagement requirements, and domestic legitimacy claims, regardless of how weak the prosecutorial record actually is. The optics of fighting corruption and the reality of fighting corruption are 2 entirely different things. This administration has learned, as every Nigerian administration before it has learned, that the optics are sufficient for most purposes. Second, opposition containment. An LP or PDP figure under active EFCC investigation cannot fundraise effectively, cannot attract international solidarity, cannot build campaign infrastructure, spends political energy and financial resources on legal defense rather than on organizing voters. The legal process, regardless of its eventual outcome, is the political weapon. The arraignment is the point, not the conviction. Third, defection leverage. And this is the one that is rarely discussed openly. A case that has been opened and held in suspension is more politically valuable than a case prosecuted to conclusion. A suspended case is a perpetual incentive for cooperation. It is an implicit offer that is never stated directly. Your political loyalty and your legal jeopardy are connected. The moment you act against political interest, the case accelerates. The moment you realign, prosecutorial urgency somehow diminishes. That's not a theory. It's a documented behavioral pattern across multiple Nigerian administrations, and it's operating now. Peter Obi's Labour Party is the most exposed. Not because it is the most corrupt. That claim could not survive scrutiny. But because it represents the most structurally threatening electoral configuration to Tinubu's 2027 coalition. Labour Party's 2023 performance in Lagos, across the southeast, and among urban youth voters was the first electoral data in Nigeria's Fourth Republic showing that a third-party candidate could, with better funding and more organizational depth, deny the APC a first ballot majority. Every LB-adjacent figure under legal pressure is one fewer node in that organizational network, one fewer fundraiser, one fewer logistics coordinator, one fewer regional mobilizer. Atiku and the PDP's northern faction face a different kind of exposure. For them, the calculation is about 2027 primary positioning. An Atiku whose financiers are under EFCC investigation cannot fund a primary campaign. A weakened Atiku is useful, simultaneously, to both Tinubu and to northern APC governors who want a different PDP direction. The EFCC pressure on Atiku's network serves multiple political interests at once. Nigeria's electoral math in 2027 will be determined by 3 variables: Labour Party's organizational recovery, the PDP's ability to unify behind a single candidate, and the APC's capacity to hold its northern base while extending inroads in the southwest and southeast. The current pattern of enforcement disrupts two of those three variables directly. It is not a coincidence that the most aggressive enforcement actions have come in states Rivers, Abia, Ambona, and Kano, where the opposition vote in 2027 is most geographically concentrated. The Southeast is watching this with a level of fury that cuts across class lines. The targeting of LB-aligned figures maps almost perfectly on Igbo political leadership at a moment when Igbo representation and inclusion in the federal structure is at its lowest point in decades. That grievance is not being manufactured by politicians. It is real, and it is being felt in market conversations, in church discussions, in academic circles, not just in political offices. In the North, the actions against figures tied to Kwankwaso's NNPP network and Atiku PDP faction are being read as Tinubu's attempt to collapse northern opposition before the next cycle. That reading is generating quiet but significant resentment among northern PDP governors who have not yet made their move. The silence from those quarters is not endorsement, it is calculation. There are 14 APC governors who face credible public allegations in state audit reports and National Assembly committee findings. None of them have spoken critically about selective prosecution. Their silence is not endorsement of the administration's position. It is a hostage arrangement. The moment any of them speaks against what is happening, they become candidates for the same treatment. The EFCC files on APC governors are not empty. They are simply inactive. And every APC governor knows this. That knowledge shapes their behavior in ways that extend far beyond this specific story. It shapes which federal directives they implement, which budget allocations they support in Abuja, which positions they take in the National Economic Council. The anti-corruption apparatus is, among other things, a mechanism for producing behavioral conformity from political allies who would otherwise have the institutional standing to push back. The EFCC's operational budget has increased by 34% since Tinubu took office. That increase was approved by a presidency-aligned National Assembly. It has not translated into more convictions. Recall that conviction rate, 12%. The budget increase has translated into more manpower, more vehicles, more media infrastructure, and more capacity for the kind of high-visibility arrests that generate political signal without generating judicial outcomes. That budget line is the financial fingerprint of an institution being scaled for political use rather than for legal effectiveness. But here is what almost nobody in Nigerian political commentary has connected, and it changes the entire picture. The Oluyokede EFCC is not operating in isolation. It is operating in documented coordination with the AGL's Office on Case Sequencing. What this means is that the decision about which case to announce, when, and in what order, that decision is not being made inside EFCC headquarters on Obojansoni Street, Wuse. It is being made in a conversation between two presidential appointees who share an institutional interest in producing the same political outcome. Technically, that is not corruption. Legally, it is within the framework of existing Nigerian law, but functionally, it is political prosecution, dressed in the language of institutional architecture, shielded by constitutional architecture, and operating with complete impunity. Let us talk about what this actually costs Nigeria, not the political class, Nigeria. If anti-corruption enforcement can be reliably used to weaken opposition at the state level, then the federal government's effective power over state politics expands beyond what the Constitution was designed to allow. Governors, even elected governors with genuine democratic mandates, govern with the awareness that a federal agency can open a case against them, their deputies, or their key political allies at any moment. That awareness shapes policy decisions. It shapes which federal directives get implemented and which ones get quietly ignored. It is a soft form of federal coercion that operates entirely below the threshold of a constitutional crisis, invisible to international observers, deniable in every individual instance, but structurally transformative in its cumulative effect. For ordinary Nigerians, the cost is indirect but real and measurable. Foreign direct investment decisions are made partly on the basis of institutional predictability, the confidence that rules apply consistently, that contracts are enforced without political interference, that regulatory agencies function independently of the executive. A EFCC perceived internationally as a political instrument raises Nigeria's risk premium. It signals institutional unreliability, and the international perception is now documented not as editorial opinion, but in the United States Department of State's 2024 Nigeria Country Report, which specifically flagged what it called selective enforcement of anti-corruption statutes. That language in a State Department report has consequences. It affects OPIC and DFC investment risk ratings. It affects the terms on which multilateral institutions lend. It affects the confidence of the diaspora in channeling remittances towards formal investment structures. At a moment when Nigeria desperately needs capital inflow, institutional credibility is not an abstract value. In the Northeast and Northwest, the erosion of legitimate political opposition creates a vacuum. Non-state actors, armed groups, insurgent networks, criminal organizations operating with political protection historically fill that vacuum. When communities cannot express political grievance through electoral channels because those channels are being systematically disrupted, they do not become politically passive. They become politically available. This is not a theoretical risk. It is the documented trajectory of the decade between 2003 and 2013 that produced the conditions for Boko Haram's expansion from a regional religious movement into a national security crisis. The connection between political marginalization, institutional delegitimation, and violence recruitment is not a Nigeria-specific theory. It is a global pattern with a Nigerian application. The perception, now widely held across the Southeast and parts of the Northwest, that anti-corruption enforcement tracks political affiliation and ethnic geography rather than evidence is a cohesion threat. Perceptions of institutional bias generate political alienation. Political alienation at scale is the precondition for the kind of centrifugal pressure that Nigeria's federal structure is least equipped to manage. And perceptions, even when they are partially contested as a matter of strict evidence, become political facts once they reach critical mass in communities that are already primed to distrust federal institutions. Now, the appointment pattern I pointed you towards in the institutional analysis, here is what it actually shows. Every FECC chair since 2015 has been appointed within 6 to 9 months before a federal election cycle intensified. Magu's reappointment pressure in 2018 came as 2019 positioning began to intensify. Bawa's appointment in 2021 came as 2023 primary calculations started moving. Olukoyede's appointment in late 2023 came immediately as post-election legal battles were concluding and 2027 groundwork was being laid. That is not random scheduling. That is a deliberate institutional cycle, ensuring that whoever controls the FECC chair controls the prosecutorial calendar heading into each election. And the current chair was appointed faster, confirmed faster, and has moved faster on opposition-linked cases than any of his predecessors in the Commission's 20-year history. Transparency International's 2023 Corruption Perceptions Index ranked Nigeria 145 out of 180 countries. Nigeria has held that position with minor variation for 6 consecutive years, across 3 administrations, all of which claimed aggressive anti-corruption enforcement as a centerpiece of their governance. The number doesn't move. The arrests do. If anti-corruption were working, the index would shift. If prosecutions were generating deterrence, the perception of corruption among businesses and citizens, which is what the TI index measures, would improve. It has not. And that's the data point that tells you with more precision than any political argument that the enforcement is not designed to reduce corruption. It is designed to manage it selectively, strategically, politically. Now, let's pull back and look at this from outside Nigeria's borders. Because this story doesn't stay inside Nigeria, and the international dimension is where it becomes particularly complicated for the administration. The US Treasury's OFEC and the DOJ's Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative have both been engaged at various points with Nigerian officials whose cases intersect with the current EFCC prosecution list. What is notable is that the cases where US cooperation has been most active, asset tracing, financial intelligence sharing, are precisely the cases involving opposition-linked figures. Cases involving APC-aligned individuals where US financial intelligence capability would be equally applicable have not, to any public knowledge, generated equivalent cooperation requests from the Nigerian side. That asymmetry in cooperation requests is itself informative. The UK's National Crime Agency has historically been more assertive than the EFCC in pursuing Nigerian political assets lodged in British financial institutions. The current environment creates a diplomatic tension that British and European anti-corruption partners are navigating with increasing discomfort. They are being asked to cooperate with an agency whose domestic credibility is publicly contested, whose own conviction rate in political cases is below 12%, while that agency's political independence is being publicly questioned by Nigerian lawyers, civil society organizations, and now on national television by figures like Kenneth. Several UU officials have raised this concern through diplomatic channels. It has been reported in Financial Times coverage of Nigeria's governance environment. It is not going away. What Nigeria is experiencing is not unique. The weaponization of anti-corruption institutions against political opponents is a documented playbook. You can trace it in Hungary under Orban, in Turkey under Erdogan, in Rwanda, in several West African states that have recently undergone democratic backsliding. The common thread is not ideology. It crosses left and right. It crosses Islam and Christianity. It crosses rich countries and poor ones. The common thread is this: the concentration of appointment power over prosecutorial institutions without independent oversight or structural accountability. That architectural flaw makes selective prosecution not just possible, but inevitable. Nigeria has that architecture. It has always had it. What changes with each administration is the willingness to use it at scale. For Nigerians abroad, in the UK, the United States, Canada, Germany, this matters directly. The diaspora is often the financial backbone of both civil society organizations and opposition political campaigns. International money moving towards Nigerian political activity does not travel unobserved. CBN and EFCC regulations on inbound remittances connected to political organizations have been tightened twice in the last 18 months. That is not a coincidence. It is a preemptive move against the one financial channel that the domestic enforcement apparatus cannot fully control. If you are Nigerian and you are watching this from outside the country, this story is about you too. What I am about to show you in the next section is where this story becomes truly dangerous. Because the most powerful argument in defense of what the Tinubu administration is doing does not come from APC politicians. It comes from a real problem inside Nigeria's opposition that nobody on either side of this debate wants to discuss honestly. Let me give you the strongest argument against everything I have just said. Because it is a real argument, and it deserves to be stated fully before it is answered. Nigeria's opposition is genuinely corrupt. This is not a qualifier or a diplomatic hedge. It is a factual statement. Peter Obi's tenure in Anambra State has documented questions around contract transparency and state fund management. Atiku Abubakar's business interests have generated credible conflict of interest concerns across multiple administrations. Nyesom Wike's governance record in Rivers State produced some of the most brazen examples of executive financial impunity in recent Nigerian history. None of these figures are political martyrs. None of them are clean. And the most intellectually serious argument for the administration's position is this. If you wait for a pure victim of political persecution to make this case, you will wait forever. Because in Nigerian high politics, there are no pure victims. The EFCC, on this reading, is simply enforcing laws that have always existed against people who have always violated them. The fact that those people are now in opposition does not create immunity from accountability. That is not persecution, that is consequence. I want you to hold that argument fully before I answer it, because it is a real argument and it reflects a genuine tension in how any anti-corruption regime must operate in a system that corruption is systemic. Here is the problem with that argument. It proves too much. If the operating criterion for prosecution is corrupt and no longer politically protected, if the trigger for enforcement is the removal of political cover rather than the discovery of new evidence, then the EFCC is not an anti-corruption agency. It is a mechanism for managing the transition of political assets from one patron network to another. The law is not being applied to reduce corruption, it is being applied to redistribute political loyalty. And that distinction matters enormously, not for the individuals being prosecuted, most of whom deserve scrutiny, but for what Nigeria ends up with institutionally. A country that cannot distinguish between anti-corruption enforcement and political management of corruption will never build institutions capable of actually fighting corruption, because every administration will inherit an EFCC calibrated to serve the previous political interest and immediately recalibrate it to serve their own. The institution never reforms, it just changes direction. Let me correct 3 misconceptions that are shaping how Nigerians are thinking about this story. The first is that this is an APC versus PDP and Labour Party issue. It is not. Prosecutorial weaponization has occurred under PDP administrations. It occurred under Buhari's APC administration in a different configuration. What is different now is the scale, the speed, and the transparency of the targeting. This is a structural problem with Nigerian institutional architecture that has never been corrected. It is not a partisan problem that resolves if the opposition wins in 2027. The next government will inherit the same tools and face the same temptations. The second is that Kenneth Okonkwo's statement should be discounted because he was a Labour Party spokesperson. The argument he made on Channels TV is documentable independently of his political affiliation. The data on selective prosecution does not require Kenneth's credibility to stand. It stands on EFCC annual reports, court filings, and enforcement timelines that are publicly accessible documents. His politics are irrelevant to whether his claim is accurate. Evaluate the claim on the evidence. The third is that if Tinubu's political opponents are corrupt, the method of prosecution does not matter. It matters enormously, not for the individuals involved, but for the institutional precedent. Every time a political prosecution succeeds in achieving its political objective, whether conviction, capitulation, or silence, it strengthens the template. The next administration uses it. The administration after that uses it. The institution never gets the opportunity to reform because it is never allowed to function independently long enough for reform to hold count. This is the piece of evidence that most people on both sides of this debate have completely missed, and it has been sitting in plain sight. In 2023, the EFCC filed more new political cases in the 6 months following the presidential election than in any comparable 6-month period in the agency's 20-year history. That is not a reflection of a sudden surge in corruption. Corruption did not increase after February 2023. What increased was prosecutorial capacity being directed at a specific political moment. The timing is the evidence, and it has been in the EFCC's own public filings the entire time. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Where does this go from here? Let me give you 3 specific moves to watch, because understanding what comes next is more valuable than cataloging what has already happened. Rather than direct presidential instruction, which would be both legally risky and politically embarrassing, the pattern will most likely continue through AGL coordination and EFCC operational decisions that maintain plausible deniability. Expect more arraignments of figures in Labour Party's Southeast structure and PDP's Northern Financier network, particularly in the 6 months preceding 2026 governorship elections in key states. The timing will not be coincidental. It never is. Watch for at least one high-profile case to be quietly discontinued or significantly reduced in the next several months, almost certainly involving a figure who has signaled, through intermediaries, a willingness to negotiate their political position relative to the APC. When that discontinuation happens, it will be framed as prosecutorial discretion based on a reassessment of evidence. It will be described in AGL language as a principled legal decision. It will actually be a political settlement, and anyone watching closely will know it the moment they see which specific case and which specific figure it involves. Watch for it in cases where the defendant controls public infrastructure or appointment leverage that the presidency needs before 2027. Labour Party and a faction of PDP are already coordinating a legal strategy built around constitutional challenges to the AGL's nolli prosequi power and legislative reform proposals for the EFCC appointment process. That effort will be slow. It will be underfunded. It will be resisted by a Senate that has no institutional interest in reducing executive control over prosecutorial instruments. But it will generate international attention, specifically from US congressional committees with West Africa mandates and from EU parliamentary groups monitoring democratic governance, that the administration will find increasingly uncomfortable as 2027 approaches and international legitimacy becomes more electorally relevant. Watch the EFCC chair's public statements in the next 60 days. Specifically, watch for any shift from prosecution language towards recovery language. When anti-corruption officials start talking about asset recovery and voluntary repatriation rather than arraignment and conviction, that signals a transition towards negotiated settlement. Prosecution becomes leverage for recovery deals. The political architecture remains intact. Watch also for any central bank or FIRS actions against LP or PDP-aligned businesses in states where 2027 governorship contests are already live. Financial pressure through regulatory bodies is often the precursor to electoral season enforcement escalation. The EFCC is not the only instrument available. If this trajectory continues, without structural correction, if Nigeria arrives at 2028, post the next presidential cycle, without having reformed the EFCC appointment process or constrained the AGF's nolli prosequi power, here is what that Nigeria looks like. An EFCC so thoroughly politicized that its international credibility is irreparably damaged, its domestic credibility already functionally gone, the actual corruption it was designed to fight having adapted, evolved, and become more sophisticated in direct proportion to the political use of enforcement against it. The corrupt become more sophisticated, the institution becomes more political, and ordinary Nigerians are left with an agency that speaks the language of accountability while consistently delivering its opposite. That question I opened this analysis with. Who is deciding which corrupt officials get prosecuted and which ones get protected? Here is the answer that the evidence builds towards. The decision is not being made by the EFCC. It is not being made by the courts. It is being made in the intersection between the presidential appointment power, the Attorney General's prosecutorial discretion, and the EFCC chair's operational calendar. 3 instruments, all controlled by or directly accountable to one office, with no independent check on any of them that has functioned effectively in the 25-year history of Nigeria's 4th Republic. Kenneth said it plainly on Channels TV. The documents say it in the numbers. What Nigeria is watching is not anti-corruption. It is political management wearing anti-corruption's uniform. And the uniform is convincing enough that by the time the next administration takes it off and puts it on again, as every administration before this one has done, most Nigerians will have forgotten that the clothes were never neutral to begin with. The question that should be driving every Nigerian's political thinking right now is not whether their side's corrupt officials should be prosecuted. They should be. All of them. Every single one. Across every party, every zone, every administration. The question is whether Nigeria will ever build an institution capable of prosecuting corruption without a political author and a political purpose behind each case. Because right now, the answer is no. Not under this institutional architecture. Not without an EFCC appointment process genuinely independent of the executive, not without a prosecutorial framework that removes the AGF's unilateral power to discontinue federal cases for unstated reasons, not without a National Assembly willing to exercise real oversight rather than perform it. Kenneth said what he said on Channels TV because it needed to be said. Whether you agree with his politics is entirely beside the point. Whether the data supports his claim is the only question that matters. And the data in the EFCC's own filings, in the Transparency Index, in the enforcement timeline, in the conviction rates, says he was right. Here is the final question I want you to sit with, and I want your answer in the comments. If the next administration, whatever party wins in 2027, inherits this same institutional architecture, do you believe they will dismantle it, or do you believe they will use it exactly the same way this administration is using it now? Your answer to that question tells you everything about what you actually believe about Nigerian institutions and about what Nigeria will need to change before any election genuinely matters. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.